Was nature designed? Tonight I want to examine some of the evidence regarding whether nature was designed or if it just happened by chance. First, we're going to think about the hummingbird. When I was at school, which is a few years ago now, no one knew how hummingbirds could fly. They could see, of course, that they could fly, but when they measured the size of their wings, when they videoed them, counted the number of wing beats per second, the calculations said that they didn't produce enough lift to be able to fly. Then in 2011, Tyson Hendrick, a biologist at the University of North Carolina, published the findings of a study he led using high-speed X-ray cameras. And they had discovered how hummingbirds manage to fly. When they're flying, hummingbirds use a figure-of-8 pattern with their wings. It's a bit like they're treading air. Their wings flap forwards and backwards, and they generate lift going in both directions, 75% on the forward stroke and 25% on the backward stroke. It's totally different from the up and down motion of most birds. And this gives them the unique ability to hover precisely in one position. It also means that they can fly backwards and that they can take off vertically. All this requires a very specialized design, not just of the bones and muscles, but also of the brain and the nervous system controlling them. The flexibility of the hummingbird's shoulder joint is unique. It allows it to move into extreme positions which other birds can't do. And unlike the wing structure of other birds, it's the equivalent of elbow and wrist joints are rigid, making the wing more like a stiff paddle. Its breast muscles are huge for the size of the bird, making up a massive 40% of the bird's total weight. Humans have invested millions of dollars trying to duplicate this complex flying system, but so far they've been unsuccessful. It all looks extremely well designed to me. Or consider another bird, the woodpecker. The woodpecker spends its day spiraling up tree trunks looking for insects. It pecks the tree trunk about 20 times a second. That's twice as fast as a submachine gun. As its head hits the tree, it experiences a force over 1,000 times the force of gravity. To put that in perspective, a force 100 times the force of gravity will give a person concussion. Yet the woodpecker does this millions of times in its lifetime. How can it do it? Its whole body seems to be built to make it able to do it. Its feet are a different shape from most other birds. Its legs are different. It has special stiff tail feathers to prop it in tight against the tree. The size and shape of its brain are ideal for this pecking. So are the shape and the physical properties of the bones in and around its head. It has a reinforced skull and beak. Joining its beak to its skull is a shock-absorbing system that's vastly superior to anything we humans have ever invented. It even has a special bone and muscle structure in its skull that wraps around its brain. It works like a seatbelt, protecting its tiny brain from damage. And then once it has the holes bored in the tree, it has a hugely long tongue to remove the insects. The woodpecker looks like it was designed to do what it does. Next, we're going to think about air. You probably don't think much about air, but air is absolutely amazing. It provides us with the oxygen which all of our cells need to function. You know that because you wouldn't survive very long at the top of Mount Everest. The air is too thin. And trees are continually recycling that air and producing more oxygen. Air is dense enough to give us all that we need. It's dense enough for birds and insects to be able to fly in it, yet it's thin enough so that we can move through it easily. Air also gives us a remarkable early warning system. The particles of air bounce off each other, causing sound to travel, enabling us to hear. Also, other particles move through the air, causing smell. Yet, remarkably, air is completely clear. We can see straight through it. We take it for granted, but life would be very different if we couldn't see through air. Air is so transparent that when I stand at Mussenden Temple on the north coast of Ireland, on a clear day, I can see Scotland. That's more than 20 kilometres away. Also, air has the amazing ability to hold water. At any moment, the atmosphere contains over 10,000 billion tons of water. Who would have thought of that? Storing billions of tons of water in thin air? And the air transports that water from the sea, where it has evaporated, and uses it to water the land. Water itself is amazing in many ways. One of my favourite is that, unlike almost anything else, water freezes from the top down. Other liquids freeze from the bottom up. But water's different. It becomes lighter as it freezes, so ice floats instead of sinking. Ice then forms a layer of insulation at the surface of lakes and rivers, which keeps the water below from freezing. So the fish and the marine life don't die. Now that is very, very clever. You can say that's all just a coincidence if you want. But to me, it all just seems amazingly well designed. Next, we're going to think about proteins. Proteins are large, complex molecules that do most of the work in the cells in our bodies. They're required for the structure, function, and regulation of the body's tissues and organs. I said proteins are large. They are large for molecules, but they're really very, very small. You have billions of trillions of them inside your body. If you could scale up a protein to the size of a penny, the proteins in your body would fill the Pacific Ocean. Proteins are chains of amino acids. These chains can be thousands of amino acids long. And the sequence of amino acids in the chain determines how the chain will fold up to make the protein. So different proteins have different three-dimensional shapes. And the three-dimensional shape of the protein determines its function. Some of these little proteins are machines. They really are machines. They use energy to perform work. That's the definition of a machine. They move, they turn, they spin around, they lever, they pump, they act to cause force and motion. I'll give you a couple of examples of protein machines. One of these protein machines produces ATP, that is the energy carrying molecule used in cells. It's a tiny rotary motor. It rotates at up to 7,000 RPM. It's so small that 100,000 of them would fit side by side in a millimeter. Some proteins are linear motors. One example is the kinesin protein that walks as it transports essential components to where they're needed in the cell. There are also proteins that act as valves and pumps. I'll put a link to a video about some of these protein machines in the description. All the machines that we experience here in the big world were designed by someone. And these little machines are better designed than the big ones. They don't even make any noise. Next, we're going to think about proteins and DNA. The information needed to build proteins is stored in DNA molecules. But those DNA molecules are built by proteins. So which came first? Proteins or DNA? This question has puzzled biologists since they first started to ponder how life arose. Do you see the problem? The information needed to build proteins is stored in DNA molecules. But those DNA molecules are built by proteins. So you can't make new proteins without DNA, and you can't make new DNA without proteins. It's the chicken and egg problem. Which came first? The chicken or the egg? You can't get a chicken without an egg. You can't get an egg without a chicken. One can't exist without the other. And it's the same with proteins and DNA. One can't exist without the other. The only way either can exist is if someone created them both at the same time. I said that information is stored in DNA molecules. And we're going to think a bit more about that now. The information needed to build proteins is stored in DNA molecules. That information is copied. It's given to several different RNA molecules. And those RNA molecules, with the help of other proteins, use that information to build new proteins. So the information within DNA molecules is passed to RNA molecules, which use it to build proteins. But how is that information stored? How is it transferred? How is it used? DNA is a long molecule that looks like a twisted ladder. It's made of 4 types of small units. And it's the sequence of these small units that carries the information. It's just like the sequence of letters on a page carry information. On a page, the order of the letters spell out messages. In a similar way, the order of these small units in DNA spell out messages. So the units within a DNA molecule are like the letters of a written language. When you write a message to someone, it only works if 3 things are true. At first, you need someone to give a meaning to each of the shapes that we call the letters of the alphabet. We take that for granted, but often the meanings of those shapes are not connected to the physical properties of the shape. A long time ago, someone just decided that a vertical line would be an L, and that a curve would be a C, that 2 lines crossed would be an X. The first thing you need is someone to assign a meaning to each of those shapes. Then, secondly, you need someone to teach you those meanings so that you can write the message. And thirdly, you need someone to teach the reader those meanings so that they can read the message. And it's the same with the language written in DNA. At first, as the meanings of the units in DNA aren't connected to the physical properties of those units, someone must have assigned a meaning to each of the units. And then secondly, as the meanings don't depend on the physical properties of the units, someone must have somehow taught the DNA those meanings so that it can write the instructions. And thirdly, someone must have taught the RNA those same meanings so that it can read them. I don't see any possible way that that could all have happened unless one individual intentionally designed the whole system. Next, we're going to think about sexual reproduction. All living things on Earth reproduce. Mammals, birds, most reptiles, many insects reproduce sexually. Fish and plants do too, though it's a bit different. Sexual reproduction is a problem for evolution. Evolution is survival of those best able to reproduce. But sexual reproduction makes it harder to reproduce. It means that one individual can't reproduce on its own. Sexual reproduction has to be the most unlikely form of reproduction. It's just far too intimate. How could that ever come about by chance? And it's very complicated. You need lots of things to be right for it to work. You need two completely different reproductive systems, male and female, to form totally independently at the same time in the same geographic location. And as well as having the right reproductive organs, the creatures also need to have the desire to use them. Neither the ability nor the desire is any use on its own. So you need the desire and the organs, both in the male and the female, to appear at the same time in the same geographic location for sexual reproduction to have any chance of working. Another system where many different things need to appear at the same time is the knee. And there are basically three types of limb joints in animals and humans. There is the ball and socket joint, which we have in the hip and the shoulder. There's the pivot joint, which we have in the elbow. And there's the knee joint. The knee joint is the largest and most complex joint in the human body. And it uses a completely different mechanism from the other joints. The thigh bone has two bumps that stick out at its lower end. The shin bone has two grooves that match the shape of those bumps at the bottom of the thigh bone. And there are two central ligaments that connect the shin bone to the thigh bone. And those ligaments form a cross. And those ligaments fit neatly inside the space between the two bumps on the end of the thigh bone. And these two bones and two ligaments form a very sophisticated and precise mechanism. Each part of that mechanism is essential. The two bones are essential because they perform a rolling and sliding motion. The two ligaments are essential because they act as mechanical linkages. They perform a vital guiding function in the joint. If just one ligament is removed, the joint can't function as a hinge. It can have no useful function. The knee can only function if it has all these parts. They must all be the right shapes to fit together. They must all be in the right places. They must all be assembled in the right way, or they're totally useless, and the knee can do nothing. They call it irreducible complexity. It means that it won't work unless all the parts are there. An example we're maybe more familiar with is the mousetrap. It won't work unless all the parts are there. If one part is missing, it's useless. It's the same with the knee. All the parts need to be there right from the start. So the knee couldn't have evolved step by step. It must have been created as a fully functioning joint. The Bombardier Beetle. The Bombardier Beetle has something a bit like a cannon on its rear end that it uses to fire a high pressure jet of boiling, irritating liquid at an attacking predator. The mechanism for this is extremely complex, but put simply, the Bombardier Beetle has a heart-shaped combustion chamber inside it, which contains mainly water. It rapidly mixes two chemicals and injects them into this chamber. It then injects a third chemical, which speeds up the reaction to explosive force. And though the beetle is less than an inch long, the jet it produces travels at a stunning 65 feet per second. And it fires these explosive discharges around 500 times a second. A similar pulse combustion technique was used to power Germany's flying bombs during World War II. The Beetle precisely times the opening and closing of the inlet valve to its combustion chamber to avoid blowing itself up. It also seems to be able to control the pressure and the direction of the resulting jet with pinpoint accuracy at a bird or a frog or another predator. Any system involving combustion has to be very carefully designed, because combustion is dangerous. I don't see how this system could have developed gradually. If any part of it is not working perfectly, it'll blow the beetle to pieces. It's another example of irreducible complexity. It won't work unless all the parts are there. It has to have been designed. The butterfly. You know that caterpillars change into butterflies. But do you know how caterpillars change into butterflies? When it reaches the end of the caterpillar stage, it sheds its skin for the last time, and it turns into a pupa or chrysalis. And under that seemingly lifeless shell, something quite unbelievable is happening. First, the caterpillar digests itself. It releases enzymes to dissolve its own tissues. The old caterpillar organs dissolve into smaller groups of cells. Some even disintegrate into single cells. If you were to cut open a cocoon or a chrysalis at just the right time, a caterpillar soup would ooze out. From this cellular soup, new and quite different organs begin to develop. The small clusters of cells that are left use the protein-rich soup around them to form body parts very different from that of the caterpillar. Spectacular colourful wings, antennae, long thin legs, large compound eyes, and all the other features of an adult butterfly. At the caterpillar, chrysalis, and butterfly stages are all completely different. But none of the stages is any use without the others. And so it's very hard to see how this could evolve gradually. The caterpillar stage is no use without the chrysalis and butterfly stages. All the stages need to be fully functional from the start for the creature to be able to survive and reproduce. Was nature designed? The hummingbird, the woodpecker, air, water, protein machines, protein and DNA, DNA information, sexual reproduction, the knee, the Bombardier Beetle, and the butterfly all show that nature was designed. And if there is design, there is a designer. The world is amazingly designed because it was designed by an amazing God.